Hello, everyone. I hope you're all doing well as we approach the end of the semester. I decided to do my final TESOL project on feminist pedagogy in the first year composition classroom. So to give you guys a bit of backstory, feminist pedagogy emerged in the 1970s along with women's studies. And I'm sure you can guess it inherently shared many similarities with women's studies, and it was greatly influenced by it. And as such, it focuses on, it focused and still focuses on intersectionality of oppression and bringing marginalized voices to the forefront, on top of challenging traditional masculine pedagogies. So in the composition classroom specifically, feminist pedagogy can serve to fulfill two of the critical roles that the English department is meant to fulfill. On the compositional side, the English department helps students think critically about difficult issues, particularly issues with multiple and complex solutions. The department should, and most often does, work to help students articulate these ideas and communicate them to broader audiences. But in a much broader sense, I truly believe the English department helps students become better citizens and people in general. It's by engaging with these larger concepts such as racism and sexism that we create better human beings. Better in the sense of being better able to understand each other, better able to understand ourselves and our own biases, and better able to understand how the world works to create these differences among us and how we must all work to acknowledge and accept those differences. Feminist pedagogy and within composition courses can act as a way to give students the opportunity to experience education as a practice of freedom, because that's exactly what writing is. It's us exercising our freedom, our freedom to really analyze and get at these diverse standpoints. So as we've noted with its influence of women's studies, one of the core goals is to foster a critical analysis and a reflection on the students' part of minority voices. Ideally, feminist pedagogy is a model with which students are practitioners of feminism in their own writing. So they employ these feminist practices. They study these feminist concepts, but without feminism necessarily being the center of study. Rather, they enact feminism in their writing. And by feminism not being the center of study, I mean more of a procedural feminism where students are given the opportunity to engage in rhetoric in ways that are meaningful to them, but the course isn't explicitly labeled feminist. This kind of helps keep student resistance at bay, depending on where they may fall along the political spectrum. But essentially, procedural feminism, which is what many scholars advocate for, seeks to employ the core concepts and tenets of feminist theory, but to bring it to the composition classroom in a way that makes sense to them and their own writing goals. But feminist scholarship in general has really worked to identify and analyze diverse standpoints, and as such, students as practitioners of feminism, whether under the label or not, would to be identifying and analyzing these diverse standpoints. collaboration is key in many of the sources that I went over for this project, such as in-class discussions, peer review, teacher-student conferences. Feminist pedagogy seeks to remove this idea that academic writing happens in a vacuum and it's one scholar, one lone scholar writing away, coming up with all these amazing ideas. It seeks to acknowledge the collaborative side of academia. And as such, it does subvert the traditional masculine pedagogies and classical rhetoric in that when they are analyzing these perspectives and these different standpoints, ideally in the beginning, students will be removed from the pressures of persuasive writing. More on that in a bit. So specifically in first year composition courses, sparking an interest in students can be very difficult. So a lot of these students that come into first year composition courses are not going to be English. They're not pursuing an English degree. Writing is not their activity of choice. So overcoming this can be a bit difficult, but it has been shown that when you do frame a course, it can engage and motivate students a bit more. So why not use feminism to frame your course? Ideally distilled, though. So in a first year writing course, it's important to introduce students to these benefits as writing being seen as a tool for change. This is something that they'll be able to use in the rest of their academic careers, both the analytic and rhetorical skills that they're learning they can carry with them, but they'll also know that their writing can serve a greater purpose, that they're not just writing in a vacuum, they're not writing for the purpose of a grade. They can and should write with a larger idea in mind. Again, procedural feminism is key, especially in first year composition courses, to reduce resistance. But one of the cool things that I really like about it is that it can relieve cognitive load on students simply by them being able to A, use that collaboration, bounce ideas off each other, but B, they get to use themselves as source material, which I'll go over a prompt in a moment that shows what this would look like. Perhaps most importantly, though, I feel it's important to point out that the feminist approach in a composition classroom does not neglect the writing process at all. There are still in-class discussions, there's still peer review, teacher-student conferences are encouraged, and introducing students to features of academic discourse and helping them to become stronger college-level writers are related goals. They are not distinct from feminist goals and rhetorical goals. They should be one and the same, essentially. So as far as classroom application, I just mentioned students getting to use their own personal experiences as evidence. And this would be perfect for, I believe her first name's Cassandra. Cassandra Woody's assignment. And here I have pulled from other scholars, specifically Woody and Detweiler and Pantelides, because it is helpful to look at previous scholarship to kind of gain a better understanding of what assignments and activities influenced by a feminist approach may look like. So Woody's assignment asked students to create a prompt, which asked them to, it asked them to define a personal value and to demonstrate an intricate understanding of how their personal history or experiences have contributed to its evolution. So their own personal source material is key here. Woody didn't necessarily touch on how to scaffold this project, but I think that implementing creative writing, which can be a way, again, of motivating students, kind of switching things up, would be a good choice for such an assignment, as students are just coming out of high school. So in investigating a value of theirs and, you know, going through the analysis of that value and how it came to be to them, it may be useful to sort of engage in a memoir activity or a personal inventory, something that's more informal. They may be more comfortable with coming out of high school, but they can use that writing as a jump start for that final product. And again, it does not neglect the writing process. It doesn't neglect rhetoric entirely. For students to be successful at a prompt like this, they would still need a provable thesis. They would have to provide that evidence of a values definition and its evolution. But the key here is they are resisting persuasion. They're not specifically trying to get their audience to agree with them. It's more of informing their audience. Detweiler and Pantelides kind of took a similar approach. They moved the prompt 50 years into the future, and they did this so that the pressing issues, when Detweiler and Pantelides were constructing this assignment, I believe it was 2016, and the election was going on, a lot of political upheaval. They didn't want students to feel that resistance or to feel cut off based off of where they fall on the political spectrum. So they just moved the prompt 50 years in the future. Both of these could be used as models for assignments. That said, they can and should be adjusted to instructor goals. So I think a good point for further application is utilizing the rhetorical situation. So making sure students know why they're writing, who they're writing to, what tone of voice they should be using when they're writing. This can all help alleviate cognitive load here, but it also just sets students up for success a bit more. And keeping all of this in mind, approaches can be combined with other approaches. So it's not an all or nothing or a one size fits all. You can include feminist pedagogy with other approaches to teaching composition. I do think it's also important to discuss some of the critiques of feminist pedagogy in the first year composition classrooms, such as it may upset the balance between instructors and students with the loss of instructor authority if they're not given enough guidance, or they're just left to write as they see fit. But if the course is not distilled, if instructors are not using procedural feminism, they run the risk of portraying themselves as pushing an agenda. Another major critique is that feminist pedagogy is often too US centered, centered on US issues. I agree, but I would argue that for a first year composition classroom, and for them to be able to use those personal experiences, familiar standpoints are key there. But the idea of a transnational feminist application may be useful in more upper level composition classrooms. So overall, it really fulfills the goals of the English department. Students are able to enter into this public discourse in meaningful and mindful ways. That said, I do believe more research needs to be done on the day-to-day scaffolding of projects for a feminist application. And here are my sources. Thank you guys for listening.